Saturday qualifying in Spielberg looked like good news for Ferrari, at least on paper. Leclerc put the SF26 second on the grid, while Hamilton landed third right behind him, and Russell took pole with a 0.236 second gap over Leclerc. For a team that had just won in Barcelona, P2 and P3 looked like a genuine foundation for a fight. The problem was that Friday had already told a completely different story. Leclerc described the car's handling as an open balance, which in plain terms means the SF26 was sliding at all four corners simultaneously rather than carrying a specific problem at one end. And when a car behaves that way on a circuit where tire temperatures are already hard to control, sustaining consistent grip across a 71-lap race becomes almost impossible. That detail from Friday mattered enormously by Sunday afternoon. The straight-line data from practice put a specific number on it. Hamilton and Leclerc were reaching 323 km per hour on the main straight, while Antonelli was doing 328 and Russell was hitting 325, leaving Ferrari 5 km per hour off Antonelli's top speed on a circuit where three main acceleration zones define the lap time and the full lap takes under 90 seconds to complete. That kind of speed deficit accumulates every single lap, and mechanical grip alone cannot compensate for it. Ferrari ran the ADUO engine at reduced output through Friday, holding the full specification back for qualifying and the race, and once they switched it on, both drivers found enough time that the Q3 result reflected genuine one-lap pace. What those front-row positions didn't represent was race pace on hard tires over 71 laps, and the Friday long-run data had already made that clear. Ferrari's positional cushion at the start didn't survive the opening laps. Pirelli's technical summary for Austria was clear on how the circuit destroys tires. Rubber wear at the Red Bull Ring is primarily thermal rather than physical abrasion, with the aged asphalt generating heat inside the tire carcass through high surface roughness, and the traction demands through the second and third sectors placing the heaviest load on the rear compounds. Pirelli also flagged that the 2026 power units are now powerful enough to produce front tire locking under braking on the downhill sections, adding another temperature variable for drivers to manage at the same time. The Friday long-run picture was unambiguous. Antonelli led on race pace with Russell close behind, both sitting in the low 1-minute 11-second range on medium tires, McLaren running around 0.2 of a second per lap back from Mercedes on an adjusted basis, Red Bull behind McLaren, and Ferrari behind Red Bull. To put a specific number on it, Hadjar in the Red Bull was producing stronger average lap times than Leclerc on the same C4 medium compound during comparable stints while managing his degradation more consistently throughout, and Red Bull carried a difficult 2026 season into their home race and still outperformed Ferrari on sustained pace at Spielberg. The average degradation rate across all teams in Friday long runs sat at 0.164 seconds per lap, and for cars with uncontrolled tire behavior, race day numbers were going to be considerably worse. The C3 hard compound was the tire that broke the race open for Ferrari. Bringing the hard into its working temperature range at the Red Bull Ring requires drivers to generate targeted rear load through committed cornering, and the short-circuit lap doesn't produce enough sustained mechanical input on its own to warm the compound gradually. A car with an open balance, sliding at all four corners rather than loading specific contact patches in a controlled manner, cannot build the focused rear load the hard compound needs to activate. The SF26's balance problem from Friday hadn't gone anywhere when the lights went out on Sunday. The evidence showed up on track. Hadjar passed Leclerc, then Norris did the same, both on the same compound at similar tire age, meaning Leclerc wasn't being beaten by fresher rubber through an undercut but losing a direct pace comparison to cars on equivalent tires. That gap came from the hard compound running outside its working window in the Ferrari, a direct consequence of the car's suspension, geometry, and current setup preventing it from achieving the heat cycle the compound required. Hamilton managed the hard tires better than his teammate but still fell back once Mode TS removed his deployment options. Verstappen attempted a pass at turn 3 on lap 11, and Hamilton defended aggressively through turns 5 and 6, forcing the Red Bull wide, but that battle drained energy at a point where Hamilton's thermal management headroom was already thin. Verstappen came back and completed the move at turn 6 later in the race, then began pulling away and Hamilton had no available response. Ferrari's lower downforce configuration was a reasonable call for a short, power-sensitive circuit. The problem was that reduced downforce shifts the cornering load generation away from the aerodynamic package and onto the mechanical contact patches of the tire, and on a hard compound already struggling to reach its working temperature, that additional mechanical demand heats the rubber unevenly and produced the degradation pattern Leclerc experienced across his second and third stints. Antonelli cleared Leclerc at turn 4 around lap 30, and from that point Leclerc was stuck in traffic without clean air to manage his temperatures, and by the time Norris also came through, a fourth pit stop was unavoidable. The Red Bull Ring sits between 660 and 750 meters above sea level, with 63 meters of elevation change across a lap. At that altitude, thinner air forces the turbocharger to push considerably harder to deliver the same compressed air volume into the combustion chamber, which means the extra load builds heat across the entire power unit. Across 71 laps in 50-degree track temperatures, those pressures compound. The team arrived in Spielberg with their first ADUO token of the season, targeting the combustion chamber. Switching to a steel alloy cylinder head allowed combustion to run at pressures and temperatures that aluminium cannot withstand, and Ferrari also raised the combustion temperature from 100 to 110 degrees Celsius while pairing the engine with an updated shell fuel blend carrying higher energy density per unit of volume. Italian media put the combined performance gain at 4 to 5 horsepower from the engine changes and another 2 to 3 from the fuel, which translates to roughly a tenth of a second per lap at this circuit. Enrico Gualtieri, Ferrari's power unit director, told reporters the update would not, on its own, shift the competitive order. He was right. ADUO 1 addressed the combustion chamber and left the turbocharger completely untouched. At altitude, that distinction matters more than at any other circuit on the calendar. The second token, expected after the summer break at Zandvoort or Monza, targets turbocharger geometry directly through revised blade design and updated materials, and Ferrari arrived at Spielberg carrying the same turbocharger specification they'd used all season. Friday practice put the gap in plain numbers. Hamilton and Leclerc topped out at 323 km per hour on the main straight, while Antonelli reached 328 and Russell 325, putting the Ferraris 5 km per hour off the championship leader on a track where 3 acceleration zones define the lap time. Hamilton radioed in with no power and received the instruction to switch to Mode TS, and that's when a performance question became a race outcome. Mode TS is a thermal management setting, which meant the hybrid system overheated and needed to pull back its own electrical output to protect itself from damage. The problem was timing. That instruction landed while Hamilton and Verstappen were fighting at turn 6, so the power unit throttled back its own deployment at the exact moment Hamilton needed full output most. Verstappen completed the move, and Hamilton had no answer. The combustion gains from ADUO 1 were real, and I would argue the horsepower numbers are meaningful in the right conditions. None of that changes the fact that a tenth of a second per lap from a combustion fix doesn't resolve a turbocharger working against altitude stress across 71 laps, and that was always the ceiling on what this token could deliver at Spielberg. That turbocharger fix is the next token, and it isn't arriving until after Silverstone. Ferrari's strategic plan centered on a 2-stop as the most competitive option. A 3-stop was viable for drivers who could secure clean air after the additional pit visit, but pit lane time loss at the Red Bull Ring runs at approximately 20 seconds in lost track position, and any extra stop has to deliver a pace advantage in the laps that follow to justify that cost. Hamilton pitted first, stopping at lap 12 for hard tires and rejoining P11. Leclerc followed on the same compound, then Verstappen stopped at lap 19 and Russell at lap 20, completing the first pit cycle without incident and putting Ferrari into their second stint on hard rubber. On lap 25, Sainz's Williams stopped on the main straight with a suspected electrical failure and yellow flags went up immediately. Antonelli, running at the front of the field, came in under the yellows and rejoined just as the virtual safety car deployed, meaning he had already absorbed the full pit lane time loss before the VSC brought the field together and missed the reduced cost stop that followed. Ferrari's pit wall called Hamilton in immediately. His radio response, "You told me too late." Already past the pit entry when the call arrived, Hamilton completed another full lap and pitted on lap 26 for a set of used soft tires, and then the pit lane closed while marshals moved Sainz's car clear of the racing surface. Leclerc, urgently needing a stop on worn hard tires, was caught on the wrong side of that closure and missed the window entirely. The timing error is a direct consequence of how short the Red Bull Ring lap is. At 4.318 kilometers with lap times under 90 seconds, the gap between a yellow flag appearing and a driver reaching the pit entry can be less than 20 seconds depending on where on the lap the flag is shown, and the instruction has to arrive immediately. Mercedes had Antonelli reacting to the yellows before the VSC was formalized. Ferrari issued the call to Hamilton at the moment he had already committed past the entry point. The downstream effect restructured both drivers' races entirely. Hamilton took 3 stops in total, his second coming on used soft rubber under suboptimal conditions rather than fresh tires, and he finished P5 at 26.393 seconds behind Russell. Leclerc required 4 stops because his hard tire pace had collapsed so completely that fresh rubber was the only tool available to stop losing further positions, and after his 4th stop, he rejoined P8 with Lawson's Racing Bulls as the nearest car behind and nothing within reach ahead. He crossed the line 45.659 seconds off the race winner. Russell won the race and jumped Hamilton into second in the championship standings, while the 41-point lead Antonelli carried into Austria over Hamilton stayed roughly unchanged. Ferrari needed to score at the front to make any meaningful impact on that deficit and left Spielberg with 10 points from Hamilton and 4 from Leclerc. Austria isn't an isolated result, and the data from earlier in the season makes that clear. In China, Mercedes was gaining close to 0.9 of a second per lap over Ferrari in the second half of the race on aged hard tires, with Russell and Antonelli improving their lap times as their rubber matured, while Ferrari's times went the opposite direction. The Barcelona win was genuine, but it came under conditions that specifically suited the SF26, a high degradation race where a 3-stop strategy covered up the car's weaknesses on longer stints. Austria provided none of those conditions, and the result reflected that precisely. The constructors' standings give the development urgency a specific frame. Mercedes sit on 262 points, Ferrari are on 190, and McLaren are on 141, which means the gap between the top 2 constructors sits at 72 points through 8 rounds and is not closing at the rate Ferrari need. The ADUO 2 token, the one that actually addresses the turbocharger, is not arriving until after the summer break, which means Silverstone gets the same power unit specification that was running in thermal management mode during the Austrian race. The British Grand Prix runs July 3 to 5 inch, a sprint format on a 5.891 kilometer circuit with 18 corners. Maggots and Beckett's is the defining sequence. A rapid left-right chain of direction changes at near flat-out speeds, generating some of the highest sustained lateral forces of any corner sequence on the calendar, and Copse, the fast right-hander before the complex, gets taken at around 290 km per hour in 7th or 8th gear and demands absolute chassis confidence. Any car generating instability under high-speed aerodynamic load will show it there. The SF26's open balance issue at Austria is exactly what those corners test. At Spielberg, the problem appeared through the medium speed sector, but at Silverstone, the speed at which that same instability arrives is higher, the sustained lateral G is higher, and the consequences of any balance breakdown are more immediate. Ferrari's rear degradation rate in Austria sat behind every other competitor on the hard compound, and the right rear tire carries its biggest sustained load of the season through Maggots and Beckett's. That problem doesn't get easier at a circuit built to target that specific part of the car. Energy management adds another layer at Silverstone. Team principals raised concerns about the 2026 cars through Maggots and Beckett's specifically before the British Grand Prix, noting that electrical power levels are now strong enough that drivers are lifting and coasting to manage deployment before the next braking zone, and a team that recovers more energy through the braking zones has more to deploy through the fast complex on exit. Ferrari's turbocharger limitation isn't altitude-specific and is less amplified at sea level, but it still affects energy recovery efficiency across the full lap relative to Mercedes. I still think Ferrari's pace is real, and the deficit to Mercedes is not as large as Austria made it appear. Barcelona was genuine. The Austrian weekend showed that the SF26 has specific circuit-type conditions attached to when it can convert pace into results, and Silverstone's layout is going to give a clear answer about which of those 2 weekends reflects the more accurate picture. Drop a comment below with what you think Vasseur needs to prioritize before Silverstone, and if you are not subscribed yet, now is a good time to hit that button.